If you are unfamiliar with the location of Lumsden, go 100 kilometres south of Queenstown in the South Island. It's a 600-something farming tourist stop for a copper, plonked in the north of Southland. Keep going another 100 kilometres and be prepared for a choppy swim over to Stewart Island. Lumsden is what we would now call a service town, a hub for the local farming community, a place you can visit and come back a decade later and find not a lot has changed. That's part of its charm. What are Lumsden's claim to fame? Two spring to mind. It's a place where former Prime Minister Bill English calls his home and will remain forever the location of New Zealand's largest ever bank robbery. St Patrick's Day, Thursday the 17th of March 1983, the Bank of New Zealand, which, by the way, that location is now being converted into a quirky Americana cafe. And in-your-face bank robbery of this kind have become all but impossible today, a thing of the past. Were a bank robbery on this scale to occur in 2024, the New Zealand Police's cyber team would be in full swing, not driving down Highway 6 at 160 kilometres an hour with their blue lights flashing. 20 years on from this momentous local occasion, the local children at Lumsden School interviewed one of the victims, Doris Brown. She was at the Bank of New Zealand that day. She was a teller. Let's listen to the beginning of that interview, thanks to Kiwi Nutter's channel on YouTube. The full interview is available there as well, and there's a link in the description. This is an eyewitness account of the robbery.
Was a lot of money stolen, and how much was stolen?
$106,000.
Oh, that's quite a lot.
It's a lot of money.
Yeah. How did the guys get the money?
By pointing guns at the staff and making the staff unlock the safe.
Oh, yeah. And I heard the copper wasn't in Lumsden, so there was no security.
No.
So
No, he was away playing golf. But then on saying that it was only less than an hour, I think, before the police were there. So that wasn't a huge issue, really, the fact that he wasn't here at the time. Yeah, because it really didn't take them that long to get here.
No. Well, it would actually seem quite sneaky where there was no police there, it was done, so they must have known something. Or
whether they knew the policeman was not there or whether it was just the day they chose to do it and it just so happened that he wasn't there, we'll never know.
Because also I think there was a lot of money, because the payroll was there, and there was a lot of money.
I think there was certainly local information from someone.
Which doesn't help.
No. No, somebody knew something locally. Something that went on in banks. Somebody knew something.
All it takes is one person to leak information.
Yes. Yeah. Those days we had armour guard who delivered cash or took away surplus cash. So it wasn't hard to work out when they were there or anything like that, to give people more of an idea of when there was. Yeah, and they would know if they had kept an eye on things, what paydays were, when there was people's pays, because in those days people mainly got paid in cash rather than going into their bank accounts. And so there was a lot of cash held for that.
Yeah, I suppose if you don't have that good security like we do nowadays, it's an easy target.
Well, it was an easy target, a very easy target. But now it would never happen like that now because of the security in the banks and the helmet thing. Well, that all came out of that particular robbery. Now that for a long time you saw on banks where they weren't allowed to wear helmets or anything in, that all came from what we went through here because they wore helmets. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and people can't see your face. So you shouldn't be doing that anyway because you can't communicate with people properly if you can't see their face. He was at that age where, oh gosh, did they have guns? It was a bit exciting. Yeah. If you call that exciting, but it sort of was at that age to think that there was guns around and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's just the way it is.
But thinking on the other side, you wouldn't really know whether they'd be mean enough to actually pull the triggers, but you never know.
I know.
You wouldn't want to put your life at risk for something like that.
And it's not worth putting your life at risk, and we were always told that.
$106,000 doesn't sound like a lot of loot, does it? But put in context, Mrs. Brown, the teller, was likely to have been on about 12 grand a year. The two helmeted robbers had a sizable score, were in and out of the bank in 10 minutes and hightailing it south. Yet, trust me, New Zealand's largest bank robbery was only the beginning of this intrigue, the starting point for a story that includes betrayal, intimidation, prison breaks, corruption and even murder. You are going to want to get to the end. With the sole policeman out playing golf, the pursuit of the two motorcyclists fleeing the scene came down to a farm contractor who had spotted the robbery in progress. In their haste, one of the robbers had left a gaping hole in the back of his backpack full of cash, and some of the notes were now dispersed in the streets of Lumsden and a trail down the state highway. When the robber with the sawn-off spotted they were being followed, he swung his weapon in the direction of the farm contractor in the ute. That promptly ended his good citizen's enthusiasm. The getaway car was only 15 minutes away. The pair then ditched the stolen motorbikes, helmets and other incriminating clothing, seeking now to escape on four wheels, since the coppers were now looking for a 2x2. Going in the car seemed like the plan in the light of day, on the kitchen table with the radio playing in the background. On the day of the robbery, just one left at the changeover point in the Datsun. The other was now stranded in a wooded area to fend for himself. You'll find out why this happened in due process. One of the side stories from this less than stellar plan, the one that's unravelling by the hour, was the ongoing rumour in the months and years afterwards that the two immediately buried some of their spoils, leading to more than one unfruitful, surreptitious treasure hunt by the locals. Who were the two? The descriptions of the pair were fairly vague, and since both were wearing full-faced helmets and wigs, witnesses saw enough to identify one as a Maori and the other as a European. Alistair Barr was the European in the Datsun. Gibson Grace was the Maori, now left to his own devices. As the police combed the area 15 kilometres from town, it wasn't long till they found the dumped motorbikes and gear. One of the stolen motorbikes was traced to Christchurch. In a separate police inquiry, that motorbike had already been linked to a group dealing in drugs, the inner workings of whom we'll get to know a lot about. Next break was when a witness reported a Datsun car acting suspiciously in the same area the day before the robbery. They had a good description. That vehicle was traced 80 kilometres south to an Invercargill car rental company. In 48 hours, the police had significant progress finding the two perpetrators. By this time, Grace had waited for the dust to settle and managed to get a ride from a newspaper delivery truck into Invercargill. Gibson Grace's accomplice, Alistair Barr, was already a well-known career criminal around town, specialising in drugs, bookmaking. Town being the city of Invercargill, population roughly 50,000. As soon as the robbery went down, amongst pub gossipers and the police circles as well, he was firmly in the top 10. That's because his encounters with the police dated back to 1968, a history that included burglaries, receiving possession of an unlawful weapon. He'd done time twice, escaped twice, been recaptured twice, rumoured to have won the National State Lottery Golden Kiwi, gambled away the proceeds, 200,000. Barr was also the prime suspect in a 1982 unsolved bombing of a police detective's house in Invercargill. In yet another, rather unsettling side story to the 1983 robbery, confirming the adage that an apple never falls far from the tree, 30 years later, Alistair Barr's son, Jason, would go on with an accomplice to murder his drinking buddy by setting him alight. Their defence was,
"We were only trying to scare him."
Yeah, right. Back to it. The planning and execution of the Lumsden bank robbery, a new episode of the Mission Impossible franchise. It wasn't. Further emphasised when Barr's fingerprints were found on one of the motorcycle helmets, which Barr said had been planted by the Southland Police, still sore about the bombing. The rental car, he said, was hired to visit his brother-in-law in Arrowtown near Queenstown, a route that meant that he had to pass through the town on the day of the crime. A police search of his house produced a note with the name Gibson Grace on it, and for good measure, there was a Christchurch phone number coinciding with the motorcycle converters. The name Gibson Grace was also familiar to the police being the plural, both New Zealand police and Australian police. He had been guilty of standover, GBH, false pretences, etc., 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 etc. It would come out, make this even more of a great movie, that he was also sidelining as a police informer, one of those he'd previously dobbed in as being a drug dealer. One guess. Barr. When police placed a lineup of mugshots in front of the newspaper truck driver, asked him to identify the bedraggled Maori bloke he'd picked up near Lumsden in the days after the robbery. Guess who he picked? Then, another Darwin Award entry, Gibson Grace's fingerprints were found on the shotgun and dumped outside the town. And, as if more evidence was necessary, no one sent for Miss Marple just yet. Although the case does have a complicated and convoluted ending, his cousin said he'd seen Bank of New Zealand money bags lying on the floor of his flat in Invercargill. Whilst all of this was going on, Barr took his opportunity to flee the coop, only to be found a week or so later in Christchurch at the house of some drug associates. We'll get to what he got up to shortly, in between knowing he was a wanted man and getting arrested. Put it this way, in the wash-up, the robbery wouldn't be his major concern. Barr was now remanded in custody in Invercargill, awaiting trial. Stick with me, people, this story is more than 2 bumbling crims. That number is about to climb to 5. Still on the loose, Grace. Having grown dope for a living, he was well versed how to go bush, simultaneously avoid pesky poachers and coppers. This was one possible explanation. If you were a bookie, wanted to take a punt, going bush was, say, 25 to 1. The other possibilities led the police to question Grace and Barr's drug associates up in Christchurch. Grace had a de facto, Michelle Hyland. She said she'd last seen her partner was when he left with Barr. Hyland identified Barr as being head of a small-time organised crime group, loosely termed
The Company.
Another company member was William Douglas Oldham. Bill Oldham had been an old cellmate of Gibson Grace. Oldham told the police, without incriminating anyone in particular, giving too much away, it had been arranged for Grace to go to Australia with a small part of the cash, $5,000. Another $1,000 was given as a bribe to a Littleton trawler captain to undertake this escape by sea. With a life on both sides of the Tasman, this part of his explanation made sense. Less so, he would have left the bulk of his cut from the robbery with the company to invest. Whilst not exactly a mirror version of the story, another member of the company, Aucklander Rick Morgan, full name Richard Graham Morgan, backed up Oldham's assertions Grace had been spirited to Australia. The odds on him fleeing to that country to make a new life in Australia, well, they'd be the equally long ones of 25 to 1. The police totalisator had the odds on Gibson Grace meeting an untimely end at 2 to 1. Clear favourite. Those odds firmed to $1.05 when 2 testimonies came forth. First was from Grace's partner, Michelle Hyland. She overheard a drunken Oldham blurting out in the company of other reprobates, "Brown beard with 2 in his head." One doesn't need to be Hercule Poirot to deduce, and brown beard meant her hubby. 2 in the head referred to him being bumped off to the fuzz she shot, possibly went is probably more an appropriate turn of phrase. Another at this party was Ian Monk, a fringe member of this shady crew. He had also overheard talk of Grace being done away. The motives were threefold. Grace was in fact now in Auckland, hiding out in a flat set up by Bar, Rick Morgan's. Rather than keeping quiet though, Grace was blabbering to anyone who entered the door of the hideout, the local pub, massage parlours, talking to them all about his newfound riches, how they'd eluded the coppers. The company wanted to end their employment contract. Doing so, that would leave more spoils for the rest of the crew. Barr also had another reason to be pissed off at Grace. At first appraisal, the execution of the robbery inside the bank looked to be textbook. When the crime hadn't gone to plan, in the heat of the moment, Grace had bottled it. Inside the Bank of New Zealand vaults was at least another $100,000. The plan was to take the cash, then get the staff to open the safe. When Barr finally got to talk to Grace at the changeover point from the motorbikes to the car, he was highly pissed off, so he took off without him. Then, to solidify the case, Grace was in fact brown toast. Another known associate of the company, Christchurch man Ian Monk, had the police blowtorch applied to him. He buckled in exchange for immunity from another charge he was facing for drug dealing. He would tell everything he knew, became the state's star witness. Similar to Highland, Monk had also overheard Alderman Morgan talking about Grace in past tense, then discreetly asked Morgan, "Is he alive or dead?" To which he received a rather blunt reply from Morgan that he had shot him twice in the head in the lounge of his Auckland flat. It would later turn out, in his time on the run, Barr had flown north armed with a crude pistol. Whilst Grace and Morgan drank solidly one night and indulged in the odd bong, Barr remained sober. When Grace flaked out after a heavy sesh, one or other of the two wrapped a towel around the weapon and put 2 shots into his head, point blank. It was on his trip home the police caught up with Barr. He was arrested, awaited trial for the bank job, which you are now highly aware was merely a starter for 10, in terms of 10 years staring at striped sunlight. The police now had descended upon Rick Morgan's Titirangi Auckland house. He kept stum, apart from admitting Grace had been in the flat. That was enough to see him arrested for harbouring a wanted man. What they didn't find was enough evidence to charge anyone for murder or disappearance, starting with a body. The very same day Morgan was arrested in Auckland, down south at Company HQ, William Douglas Oldham was appearing in the Christchurch court, facing charges of attempting to break Barr out of jail. Oldham had acquired a broken-down pistol, inclusive of a silencer. Barr's mum was to be the mule to smuggle it past the guards at Invercargill prison. The police got a tip-off and intercepted the weapon. Despite the main characters now being behind prison, the police still had a lot of work to do, bringing Barr to court on the bank job, the disappearance of Grace, Morgan with his involvement with the disappearance of Grace. 6 months after the initial search of the house, a more thorough search was undertaken of Morgan's old flat. Grace's body was found buried underneath the garage. A trial for his murder would keep both men in custody. But first, a little matter of the Lumsden B&Z. That crime would need to be addressed. 3 years after the robbery, Alistair Barr, the accused, was now in court over this robbery. I know what you are now thinking. This was cut and dry, right? And this is what the defence had to say about the state's case. Their main pillars: the rental car. He was using it to travel up to see his brother-in-law the same day, which was backed up by several witnesses. It was just simply coincidence. The loot, all that cash he had. He was a bookie and a drug dealer. What do you expect? If it wasn't Barr, who was Grace's partner then? The other man behind the helmet was none other than Richard Graham Morgan. One of Morgan's cellmates testified that he had boasted to him that he was behind the robbery. The fingerprints must be a slam dunk, though. Nope. After the unsolved bombing, the same detective that was on that case was on this one as well. He'd been open in the past about how he would, quote,
nail Bar by hook or crook.
forced to admit that in court, as well as making similar statements that he was actually actively seeking revenge. If this spectre of police corruption wasn't enough on its own, Barr's defence team put another Invercargill detective on the stand. In a completely unrelated matter, this detective had testified Barr's standing in the community in order to rescind an order that had seen him banned from the local racetracks, being a bookie. His referral saw this ban reversed. Barr's defence said their client had paid the detective a bribe to make this reference. There was enough doubt to see a hung jury in Trial 1. Then, the same result in Trial 2. The police were now really sweating it. That's because there were bigger fish to fry. If they wanted to prove Barr was front and centre in the murder case, and previously he'd been found by a jury of not having anything to do with the robbery, hey presto, there would be no motive. They breathed a sigh of relief when at the third trial, Barr was finally found guilty and got 8 years. By now, you probably get the idea that Barr and Morgan weren't exactly on friendly terms. Both of them were incorrigible liars. It was going to be impossible for the police prosecutors to prove who exactly pulled the trigger, execution style, in the murder of Gibson Grace. Now in court facing life in prison, the acrimony between the two was palpable. Testimony as to the events of the night in question followed the same formula, only it was the other chap that put the 2 bullets in the head. Both even admitted burying the body together. It was Barr's gun that killed Grace. Then again, Morgan had freely admitted to others that he had put
2 slugs into his Swede.
Behind this more courtroom drama, legal arguments raged as to what was permissible in terms of evidence. At one stage the whole trial was on the verge of being abandoned. The judge offered Morgan's defence team the opportunity to be tried alone. This they rejected. Other interruptions came in the form of both defendants abusing each other whilst they were testifying. The police's tactics of giving them enough rope to hang themselves worked. In 1986, Barr and Morgan both got life. That sentence they appealed, separately, unsuccessfully. The visceral hatred between the two continued behind bars. Barr took a private prosecution against Morgan for perjury. Next up, Oldham. He was tried in 1988 as being an accessory after the fact. He was found not guilty. That's the end of this one. I hope you enjoyed this number. I've had this story to do for close to 2 years. From what you've heard, you'll see it had plenty of twists and turns. I do like bringing such stories, unique and interesting Kiwi ones, to light broadly every week. My plea today is, before AI swamps both YouTube and podcasting formats with ghastly computer-generated voices, photos that only have the vaguest resemblance of the subject in question, do support independent, real people making content like this humble creator. Oh yeah, and don't forget you can listen to the bank teller's full recount of the events on YouTube by searching for Lumsden Bank Robbery. And if anyone wants to know what happens to these chaps, I don't have a bloody clue. If you've got anything out of this podcast, you now know the catalyst for New Zealand banks to introduce the policy to ban face coverings. Thanks for your time today. Do come back for more podcast episodes from Weird NZ. Bye for now.